Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. The grand spires of the Kalan Empire stretch toward a sky of perpetual twilight, their edges sharp and unforgiving like the warriors who built them. In the heart of this militaristic world, a union had been forged not of affection, but of cold political necessity. Vilas, a proud and highly decorated female commander of the Kalan vanguard, stood at the towering crystalline window of her grand estate. She cast a long, imposing shadow across the metallic floor. Behind her, in the quietest corner of the vast room, sat her newly acquired spouse, Alan Anthony. Alan was a human woman from Earth, impossibly small and delicate when measured against the towering, muscular frames of the Kalan species. While the Kalan adorned themselves in heavy battle armor and ceremonial plating that hummed with kinetic potential, Alan wore only simple woven garments of muted gray and soft white. She seemed entirely out of place in a world built on the foundations of conquest and overwhelming dominance. Yet, Alan never appeared intimidated. She spent her days entirely devoted to a peculiar and seemingly useless hobby. Her slender fingers would carefully disassemble, clean, and rebuild ancient terrestrial audio equipment. Turntables, brass phonographs, and intricate speaker cones cluttered her designated quarters. Whenever the Kalan elites visited the estate, they would sneer at the human, tossing heavily veiled insults about her frailty and her obsession with dead technology. Alan would only offer a soft, gentle smile in return, never raising her voice, never showing a single flicker of resentment. To understand the depth of the Kalan disdain, one had to understand their biology. Their society worshipped absolute physical supremacy and the powerful emission of brainwave frequencies. A Kalan citizen's worth was measured by the psychic pressure they could project, a tangible aura of dominance that commanded respect and instilled fear. Alan, however, possessed absolutely no readable brainwave signature. To the highly attuned senses of the Kalan, looking at Alan was like staring into an empty void. She registered as completely flat, a psychic deaf-mute, an organism so biologically inferior that she did not even register as a threat on their lowest sensory thresholds. They saw her as nothing more than a fragile pet, a political concession granted to the weak human territories in exchange for border peace. Vilas, despite her reputation as a ruthless and unyielding warrior, found herself wrestling with an unfamiliar tightness in her chest whenever she watched her human wife. There was a profound melancholy in the way Alan existed, a quiet resilience that defied traditional Kalan logic. Vilas had been trained from birth to despise weakness, yet she felt a strange, protective instinct taking root within her rigid military mind. This internal conflict reached its peak during the annual Emperor's Gala, a massive gathering of the highest-ranking warlords and tacticians in the empire. The banquet hall was a cavernous dome of reflective obsidian, filled with the aggressive, overlapping psychic auras of hundreds of predators vying for absolute dominance. Alan stood quietly by a table of refreshments, clad in a simple, deep blue dress, looking entirely absorbed in the structural resonance of a nearby crystal pillar. Vilas was locked in a tense, strategic discussion across the room, but kept her sharp, golden eyes darting toward her wife. Suddenly, General Kalkor, a massive brute and Vilas's chief political rival, approached Alan. His intention was clear. He wanted to humiliate Vilas by breaking her fragile human spouse. Kalkor did not raise his hand. Instead, he unleashed a concentrated, overwhelming wave of psychic pressure directly at Alan. The sheer force of the invisible attack was enough to make the air vibrate. Nearby, Kalen officers winced, and the delicate crystalline glasses on the refreshment table began to rattle violently, threatening to shatter under the immense unseen frequency. Valus felt the spike in pressure and immediately pushed her way through the crowd, her own aura flaring in pure rage, intending to shield her wife from the brutal assault. But before Valus could reach them, she witnessed something that defied all comprehension. Alan did not collapse. She did not clutch her head in agony or bleed from her sensory organs as a normal human should under such an overwhelming attack. Instead, Alan let out a slow, steady breath. With methodical calmness, she reached out and began rearranging the violently rattling glass cups. She adjusted their positions on the table by mere millimeters, aligning them with an unseen pattern. Then, Alan began to hum. It was a low, strange, rhythmic melody, a sound that seemed to lack any psychic weight, but carried an impossible physical density. The humming intertwined perfectly with the clinking of the vibrating glasses, creating a bizarre acoustic resonance that echoed locally around the table. The effect on General Kelkor was instantaneous and shocking. His aggressive psychic projection faltered abruptly. The massive warlord stumbled backward, his face draining of color. He gripped the edge of a table, suddenly overcome by a severe, inexplicable bout of dizziness and intense nausea. He gasped for air, his equilibrium completely shattered by the seemingly harmless tune slipping from the human's lips. The other officers watched in bewildered silence as the mighty general retreated, clutching his stomach, entirely defeated without a single physical blow being struck or a single psychic wave being returned. Later that evening, long after the gala had ended, Valus found Alan back in their estate, carefully polishing a brass acoustic horn under the dim light. The Grand Commander stood in the doorway, her imposing silhouette framed by the hallway light. Valus crossed the room, her heavy boots silent on the floor, and stopped beside the small human. She looked down at Alan, her voice rough and laced with genuine confusion. "Why do you never show anger?" Valus asked, her tone carrying a mix of frustration and awe. "Why do you never fight back when they mock you, when they try to crush you? You possess something they do not understand, yet you let them believe you are nothing." Alan paused her work. She set the polishing cloth down and turned to face her towering Kalen wife. The human's eyes held the depth of ancient, silent oceans. She offered that same gentle, melancholic smile, but this time, Valus could see the immense weight of countless generations behind it. "Because, my dear Valus," Alan replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "true survival is not about having the loudest roar. It is about knowing exactly when it is necessary to remain completely silent." The aftermath of the Emperor's Gala left a lingering shadow of curiosity in Valus's mind. The Grand Commander could no longer dismiss her spouse's eccentricities as mere human fragility, driven by an unfamiliar need to understand the enigmatic creature she had married. Valus made the unprecedented decision to cross the threshold into Alan's private workspace. The heavy, automated doors slid open with a soft pneumatic hiss, revealing a sanctuary that stood in stark defiance of Kalen utilitarian design. It was not a room of leisure or simple art, as Valus had previously assumed. It was a meticulously organized laboratory. Valus recognized the layout immediately. The spatial efficiency, the rigid categorization of tools, the sterile metallic surfaces. It was the exact configuration of a military munitions bunker. Yet, instead of plasma warheads, the workbenches were lined with delicate sonic calibrators and an array of strange, translucent data crystals. Alan stood at a primary workstation, her eyes locked onto a holographic waveform, adjusting microscopic frequencies with the terrifying, calculated precision of a siege engineer, priming a weapon of mass destruction. Valus realized then that her wife was not a mere tinkerer. Alan was a sound architect. In the martial culture of the Kalan, manipulating sound was considered a frivolous, aesthetic pursuit, suitable only for entertainers and children. But observing the intense, methodical nature of Alan's labor, Valus felt a cold chill creep beneath her armor. The air in the room was heavy, thick, with a constant, almost imperceptible vibration. The alien data crystals, utterly incompatible with any known Kalan neural interface technology, pulsed with a dull, rhythmic thrum. They emitted ultra-low frequencies that bypassed the ears completely, resonating directly within the marrow of Valus's bones. It was a sound that felt like the agonizing, slow shifting of tectonic plates deep within a dying planet. Their silent coexistence in the laboratory was abruptly broken 2 days later by the arrival of an uninvited guest. High Scholar Zareth, a notoriously arrogant academic from the Imperial Archives, had demanded an audience. He marched into Alan's sanctuary without waiting for an escort, his heavy ceremonial robes sweeping aggressively across the polished floor. Zareth belonged to a radical political faction that vehemently opposed the diplomatic union with humans, viewing them as evolutionary dead ends. He sneered openly at the intricate crystalline arrays lining the walls, dismissing them as primitive glass baubles. Zareth possessed an exceptionally potent telepathic signature, and he made sure to project a suffocating aura of intellectual superiority, filling the room with an invisible, oppressive weight. He scoffed at the notion of human history, declaring it a fleeting, insignificant anomaly in the grand, conquering narrative of the universe. Ignoring Valus's stern warning glare, the arrogant scholar decided to prove his point. He sought to demonstrate the absolute dominance of the Kalan mind over primitive human technology. Without asking for permission, Zareth brazenly extended his consciousness, attempting a forced, direct neural uplink with the largest cluster of Alan's data crystals. He intended to sift through the human historical records and broadcast their pathetic struggles into the room as a telepathic mockery. The moment Zareth's mind made contact with the crystal matrix, the smug superiority vanished from his features, replaced instantly by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. He did not simply read data. He was violently pulled into an abyssal archive of suppressed ancestral memory. The scholar let out a sound that was half gasp, half shriek, his tall frame convulsing violently. He collapsed onto the cold metallic floor, his limbs rigid and spasming out of control. Thick, dark blood began to steadily pour from his nose, his ears, and the tear ducts of his wide, unseeing eyes. The neural feedback was catastrophic. Through the immense psychic bleed-off, Valus caught a fragmented, terrifying glimpse of what Zareth was experiencing. It was a horrifying vision of a time humans called the Rift Era. Valus saw a primitive Earth, not burning with conventional plasma fire, but tearing itself apart from the inside out. She saw billions of human minds linking together in a chaotic, deafening crescendo, weaponizing their own collective consciousness. They were weaponizing the very fabric of reality to shatter their enemies and themselves. It was a cacophony of madness, a psychic singularity that threatened to devour their entire solar system. Before Valus could draw her weapon or call for a medical extraction team, Alan moved. The gentle, melancholic wife vanished entirely. In her place was a blur of calculated, clinical efficiency. Alan lunged forward, her hands flying across the crystal array to sever the connection with a brutal, mechanical chop. She dropped to her knees beside the convulsing scholar. There was absolutely zero panic in the human's eyes. Her movements were cold, rapid, and flawlessly executed. She produced a specialized medical auto-injector from her belt, a device she had clearly modified, and drove it directly into the base of Zareth's skull. She manipulated his alien pressure points to stabilize his plummeting heart rate, her face a mask of absolute, terrifying calm. She treated the dying, immensely powerful alien with the detached routine of a mechanic, tightening a loose bolt on an engine block. The air in the laboratory remained heavy, with the metallic scent of Kalan blood and the lingering phantom vibrations of the interrupted data stream. Zareth's violent convulsions finally ceased, subsiding into a shallow, ragged breathing pattern. He lay unconscious on the floor, an arrogant intellectual giant reduced to a broken, whimpering shell by a mere glimpse into human history. Powerless stood frozen, her hands still hovering over the hilt of her ceremonial blade. The Grand Commander had witnessed the slaughter of entire planetary defense forces without blinking, yet the sheer, concentrated horror she had felt radiating from the scholar's mind left her deeply unsettled. She looked down at Alan. The small human woman was calmly wiping a smear of dark blue Kalan blood from her own wrist using a sterile cloth. Her breathing perfectly even. Her pulse completely undisturbed by the life or death crisis that had just unfolded in her sanctuary. Powerless took a slow, heavy step forward, her golden eyes fixed intensely on her spouse. "What did he see?" "Alan," Powerless demanded, her voice echoing off the metallic walls, stripped of its usual commanding edge and replaced by genuine, cautious inquiry. "When his mind breached that crystal, I felt a ripple of it. I felt a destruction that defies all military logic. What exactly is hidden within your archives?" Alan carefully disposed of the bloodied cloth into a thermal incinerator unit. She turned to face her wife, and for a fleeting moment, the weight of the universe seemed to rest upon her fragile shoulders. The gentle smile she offered this time was not one of submission, but one of deep, enduring sorrow. "He saw the reason why we are so quiet. Powerless," Alan explained, her voice as smooth and cold as polished ice. "Your people look at humanity and see a biological failure. You measure our worth by the silence of our minds. You believe that because we do not project our thoughts, because we do not shatter glass with our presence, we are inherently weak and defenseless." Alan walked slowly toward the primary workstation, her fingers lightly brushing against the dormant surface of the crystal matrix. "But you misunderstand the nature of our evolution. During the Rift Era, over 5,000 years ago, humanity did not lack power. We had too much of it. We learned how to synchronize our neural pathways, to turn our collective consciousness into a weapon that could unravel the very atomic bonds of our enemies. We nearly tore our own sector of space into a realm of formless static." She turned back, meeting Powerless's intense gaze with an unwavering stare. The atmosphere in the room felt suddenly colder. "We did not lose our voices, Commander. We chose to bury them. We genetically locked away our psychic signatures, sealing them behind an impenetrable wall of silence. Our silence is not a symptom of our frailty." Alan gestured downward at the unconscious, bleeding scholar at their feet. "Our silence is a safety lock, painstakingly designed and strictly maintained, to protect the rest of the universe from what we are truly capable of becoming if we are ever forced to scream again." The planetary defense grid of Kalan Prime did not sound a warning siren. It simply ceased to function. At exactly 14 hours and 30 minutes standard planetary time, the orbital sensors, the absolute pinnacle of the Empire's surveillance network, went entirely dark. A spatial tear, stretching thousands of miles wide, violently ripped open the twilight sky directly above the grand capital city. It did not bring a conquering armada of dreadnoughts or invading drop pods. Instead, the void birthed a colossal, writhing nebula of pure, aggressive energy. The deepest, most restricted Kalan archives held only fragmented, terrified whispers of this entity. They called it the Hollow Chorus, The Hollow Chorus was not a conventional military force. It was an apex predator of the mind. It manifested as an apocalyptic telepathic resonance storm, a churning vortex of screaming colors and impossible, maddening frequencies. It descended upon the atmosphere like a starving beast, actively hunting for the bright, powerful psychic signatures that heavily defined the Kalan species. As the edge of the storm touched the upper atmosphere, its true, horrifying nature was revealed. It did not burn flesh or shatter bone. It consumed biological consciousness. Victims caught in the initial shockwave were stripped of their minds instantly. The forced psychic absorption caused a catastrophic cellular transmutation, instantly freezing the agonizing Kalan warriors into grotesque, lifeless statues of jagged, opaque crystal. Grand Commander Velas was immediately deployed to the primary planetary defense network. She stood rigid on the command deck of her heavy cruiser. The sky outside the main viewport was a swirling maelstrom of violet and sick green energy. "Open fire!" Velas roared, her voice cutting sharply through the rising panic on the bridge. "Unleash the antimatter batteries! Fire at maximum yield!" Thousands of defensive batteries across the planet's surface and the orbiting fleet unleashed a devastating, synchronized barrage of antimatter torrents. The sheer firepower was enough to crack a small moon in half. But the Hollow Chorus did not attempt to evade. It swallowed the antimatter streams whole. The storm absorbed the immense kinetic and thermal energy, violently churning it within its nebula before converting it entirely into a psychic payload. Exactly 1 second later, the entity reflected the absorbed power back down upon the planet as a singular, world-shattering telepathic scream. The blowback was instantaneous and catastrophic. The psychic scream bypassed all physical armor, kinetic shielding, and fortified bunkers. It struck directly into the central nervous systems of the Kalan people. Panic, raw and unadulterated, swept across the entire globe. Millions of the galaxy's most formidable warriors, beings who prided themselves on their indomitable willpower and psychic dominance, collapsed simultaneously. They clutched their heads in agony, their powerful auras flickering and dying as their brains overloaded under the impossible pressure. The entire military high command, the strategic heart of the conquering empire, disintegrated in just under 3 hours. Communication channels dissolved into a chaotic, terrifying mess of agonizing shrieks and sudden, dead static. High in the burning atmosphere, a secondary resonance wave from the storm slammed violently into Velas's flagship. The vessel's heavily armored hull groaned and twisted under a force that defied gravity and basic physics. The primary power core ruptured. Alarm klaxons blared uselessly as the massive warship plummeted from the sky. The immense impact tore the Earth apart. Velas forcefully dragged her broken body from the burning, twisted wreckage of the command deck. Her heavy combat armor was warped and sparking. More devastatingly, her mental shield, the iron fortress of her formidable mind, was completely shattered. Every breath she took felt like inhaling broken glass, and her vision swam nauseatingly with the maddening, swirling colors of the chorus descending upon her position. She collapsed onto her knees in the ash-choked dirt, surrounded by the haunting crystalline remains of her finest soldiers. The Grand Commander looked up at the churning vortex above, her golden eyes dimming. She gripped the hilt of her broken blade tightly, preparing to meet her end. Then, cutting sharply through the deafening roar of the psychic hurricane, came the high-pitched whine of thrusters. It was not a sleek military rescue craft or a heavily armed dropship. It was a small, obsolete civilian transport ship, its hull heavily scarred and its engines sputtering wildly. The tiny vessel descended erratically, fighting the chaotic atmospheric currents tooth and nail, and slammed violently onto the battlefield, mere yards from where Valus knelt in the dirt. The loading ramp hissed open with a cloud of exhaust. Out stepped Alan. She wore the exact same simple, muted garments she always favored, her hands completely empty of any weaponry. There was no energy shield enveloping her, no bulky combat armor to protect her fragile human frame. The psychic storm raged violently around the transport, tearing massive chunks of steel from the fallen Kalan cruiser and whipping the crystallized remains of dead warriors into a blinding shrapnel blizzard. The hollow chorus surged forward aggressively, eager to consume this newly arrived biological consciousness. A wave of concentrated telepathic pressure, heavy enough to effortlessly crush a battle tank, crashed directly over the small human woman. But absolutely nothing happened. Alan did not fall to her knees. She did not bleed. She did not even flinch. The apocalyptic resonance simply passed right through her body, finding no psychic footprint to latch onto, no active brainwave frequency to consume. The absolute void of her mind rendered her functionally invisible to the apex predator of the cosmos. With a calm, perfectly measured stride, Alan walked right through the dead center of the world-ending psychic storm. She stepped carefully over burning debris and the frozen crystal statues of fallen giants, her gentle face an anchor of terrifying serenity amidst the swirling chaos. She made her way slowly toward her broken wife, entirely unharmed, completely untouched by the raging apocalypse, shielded solely by her profound, impenetrable silence. The thick air was suffocating, clogged with the pulverized remains of Kalan architecture and the metallic tang of vaporized blood. Yet Alan moved through the apocalyptic wreckage with a terrifying, mechanical grace. She did not hesitate or falter as the ground trembled beneath her feet. Reaching the fallen Grand Commander, Alan hooked her arms under Valus's heavy, armored shoulders. To Valus's absolute astonishment, the small human hoisted her up. It was not a display of hidden brute strength or sudden biological enhancement, but a flawless application of leverage and kinetic redirection. Alan dragged her wife toward the battered transport ship, her movements sharply calculated, ruthlessly efficient, and entirely devoid of the gentle, hesitant demeanor she had maintained for years. Along the way, Alan paused only to grab the collars of 3 other severely wounded, unconscious Kalan soldiers. She utilized emergency anti-gravity tethers from her utility belt to haul their massive frames up the ship's loading ramp, tossing them inside with surprising speed. She was no longer a quiet, subservient spouse. She was a hardened combat medic operating in a deadly hot zone, executing an extraction with the cold, surgical precision of a veteran who had seen worlds end before. Once inside the cramped, dimly lit cargo bay, the heavy metal ramp sealed shut, abruptly cutting off the deafening roar of the psychic hurricane outside. Valus leaned against the cold steel bulkhead, clutching the jagged, sparking edges of her ruptured chest armor, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. She watched, completely mesmerized, as Alan sprinted to the pilot's seat and initiated the rapid launch sequence. The battered transport ship violently lifted off the cracked earth, its engine screaming as it dove straight back into the churning green and violet maelstrom of the storm. By all known logic, the unshielded craft should have been torn apart instantly, its occupants reduced to screaming crystal statues. Yet, the hollow chorus ignored them entirely. Valus stared at her wife's focused profile, illuminated by the harsh glow of the console lights. The realization struck the Kalan commander like a physical blow to the head. Alan's harmlessness was not an absence of power or a biological defect. It was an active, meticulously maintained state of absolute zero. Her brainwaves were not just quiet. They were a deliberate, genetically engineered void. It was a perfect biological blind spot. The apex predator of the cosmos could only hunt what it could feel, and it could not hunt what fundamentally did not exist on its immense sensory spectrum. The transport ship violently bucked and shuddered as it navigated the severe atmospheric shear. But it remained completely untouched by the devastating telepathic attacks that were currently vaporizing the Kalan fleet. Suddenly, the main communication console on the dashboard flared to life, cutting through the heavy, oppressive static of the storm. It was a highly encrypted, broad-spectrum distress frequency, originating from the deepest, heavily fortified subterranean bunkers of the Kalan High Command. The transmission was utterly desperate, entirely stripped of all traditional imperial arrogance and militant pride. The surviving warlords and planetary defense architects had been tracking the impossible telemetry of Alan's civilian craft. They watched their tactical monitors in sheer disbelief as the tiny, practically unarmed vessel defied every single known law of physics and tactical logic, surviving perfectly intact while their invincible dreadnoughts burned and fell from the sky. The crackling, panicked voice of Supreme General Tarkin filled the small cockpit, practically begging Commander Valus to share her miraculous escape vector, demanding to know what experimental, classified shielding technology she had deployed to evade the wrath of the psychic storm. Valus opened her mouth to respond, to report her catastrophic failure and the bewildering, miraculous survival of her human wife. But she never got the chance. Alan abruptly reached across the navigation console and forcefully seized direct control of the primary transmission feed. She did not ask for permission. She did not offer a formal military greeting or observe any Kalan chain of command protocol. Her voice, usually so soft and accommodating, now possessed the sharp, unyielding edge of a tempered steel blade. "This is Alan Anthony," she declared, her tone cutting through the panicked, chaotic chatter of the high command like a surgical scalpel. "You will immediately issue a global override. Shut down every single planetary defense shield. Power down all antimatter batteries, every plasma cannon, and every orbital kinetic grid. You have exactly 60 seconds to cut all power across the entire globe, or your entire world will be consumed and turned to dust." A momentary, deeply stunned silence followed her transmission. For a brief second, the war room was completely quiet. Then, the comms erupted into a chaotic, deafening symphony of outrage and furious indignation. The proud Kalan leaders screamed that such an action was pure, unadulterated suicide, a treasonous order that would leave their glorious homeworld completely defenseless against the cosmic entity. They threatened immediate execution, demanding Valus arrest the human. Alan did not flinch, nor did she break eye contact with the monitors. Her hands flew rapidly across the holographic displays, pulling up complex, highly advanced telemetry data and acoustic physics models. "Your weapons are not defending you," Alan fired back, her voice projecting absolute, undeniable authority that silenced the room of warlords. "You are fighting a massive, localized resonance storm, not a physical military armada. Your energy shields and antimatter bursts are emitting specific frequencies that perfectly match the harmonic structure of the hollow chorus. Every single time you fire, every single time you raise a kinetic barrier, you are directly feeding the storm. You are providing the exact acoustic nourishment it desperately needs to expand its reach. You are actively killing yourselves with your own pride." The sheer, cold logic of her scientific explanation forced a terrifying, heavy pause in the Kalan bunker. The generals stared at their own sensor readings, realizing the human was absolutely correct. Valus watched her wife, a profound sense of awe entirely replacing the lingering terror in her chest. Alan leaned closer to the microphone, delivering the final, devastating truth to the alien empire. "You deeply believe you are the first civilization to face this entity." Alan continued, her words heavy with the weight of ancient, highly classified human history. "You are not, humanity encountered the hollow chorus over 800 years ago, we learned the hard, bloody way that you cannot shoot a hurricane. You cannot punch an earthquake. We did not use brute force or superior firepower to win. We used calculated subtraction. She turned her head slightly, meeting Velus's wide, glowing golden eyes, as she broadcast humanity's greatest secret to the entire Kalan hierarchy. My ancestors systematically altered the human genome. They designed specific, highly controlled lineages, people exactly like me, to act as living circuit breakers. We are biological dampeners, specifically engineered to wade into the absolute dead center of a psychic anomaly and ground the devastating current. Now, shut down your grid, and let me do exactly what I was built to do. The target was the Imperial Spire, a towering monolith of conductive alloys that served as the primary communication relay for the entire planetary grid. It was the only structure capable of broadcasting a signal powerful enough to blanket the globe. However, the spire was currently functioning as the absolute epicenter of the psychic hurricane, drawing the churning storm around its peak like a colossal, violent vortex. Alan explained her strategy with the cold, detached precision of a seasoned field general. She needed to reach the central command deck at the very summit of the spire. From there, she could interface her own biological frequency dampeners with the global amplifiers, effectively broadcasting a massive inverse acoustic wave designed to completely cancel out the harmonic resonance of the hollow chorus. It was a mission of absolute desperation, requiring them to march directly into the heart of a cosmic anomaly that had already slaughtered millions of their finest warriors. Hearing this plan, Velus looked at the small human standing in the dimly lit cargo bay, and the final illusion of the helpless, delicate spouse completely shattered. The Kalan commander finally understood the terrifying truth about humanity. They were not fragile. They were heavily restrained. The woman before her was not a civilian. She was a living, breathing weapon of mass destruction, forged by a species that had survived the apocalypse by weaponizing their own biology. With a renewed sense of purpose and a profound, undeniable reverence for her human wife, Velus pushed through her agonizing injuries. She turned to the 3 wounded Kalan soldiers Alan had dragged aboard. They had regained consciousness, their heavy bodies battered and their minds reeling from the psychic shockwaves. Velus issued her commands with absolute, unyielding authority. They were to form an impenetrable phalanx around the human. They would act as a literal wall of flesh and armor, shielding the living circuit breaker from any physical threats until she reached the control console. They were no longer the proud conquerors of the galaxy. They were merely the transport mechanism for the universe's most dangerous silence. The tactical breach of the ruined capital city was a nightmare of twisted metal and suffocating ash. The squad moved out of the transport ship and advanced toward the towering spire. The psychic storm raged above them, tearing at their minds. But as long as they remained within a tight radius around Alan, the localized null zone she passively generated provided a fragile, life-saving bubble of mental clarity. The streets, however, were not empty. The Kalan forces, who had not been immediately turned to crystal, had suffered a fate far worse. Their minds had been completely overridden by the parasitic resonance of the storm. Hundreds of massive, armored Kalan warriors lumbered toward them through the thick smoke, their eyes glowing with a sickening, toxic violet light, their weapons raised with mindless, hostile intent. The 3 Kalan escorts raised their heavy plasma rifles, preparing to slaughter their own corrupted brethren. But Alan sharply ordered them to hold their fire. She refused to let them waste ammunition or needlessly kill soldiers who were merely victims of a parasitic frequency. Instead, Alan demonstrated a terrifying mastery of environmental physics. As the horde of mind-controlled soldiers charged down a narrow, enclosed avenue, Alan sprinted toward a heavily damaged support pillar, holding up a massive overhead causeway. She did not use explosives. She simply placed her hands on the cracked stone, closing her eyes to feel the deep, groaning vibrations of the damaged architecture. Reaching into her satchel, she pulled out a small, heavy tuning fork made of a dense terrestrial metal. She struck it sharply against her boot and pressed the vibrating stem directly against a specific hairline fracture in the alien pillar. The acoustic result was instantaneous and devastatingly precise. The exact resonant frequency of the tuning fork perfectly matched the compromised structural integrity of the stone. The pillar shattered from the inside out, triggering a calculated chain reaction. The heavy overhead causeway collapsed downward in a massive cloud of dust and debris, completely blocking the avenue and trapping the corrupted soldiers behind a wall of impenetrable rubble without causing a single casualty. Valus watched in sheer disbelief as Alan repeated this impossible tactic 3 more times during their ascent, turning the ruined architecture of the Kalan capital into a series of flawless, non-lethal traps. The human weaponized the very geometry of the city, applying the cold, indisputable laws of acoustic physics to outmaneuver an army of super soldiers. After 2 grueling hours of climbing through the darkened, spark-filled maintenance shafts of the spire, the squad finally breached the central control room. The chamber was massive, dominated by towering cylindrical energy amplifiers that hummed with terrifying, raw power. The storm outside was deafening, the atmospheric pressure threatening to crush the thick, reinforced glass of the observation deck. Alan wasted no time. She moved rapidly to the primary amplification console, opening her satchel. From it, she withdrew the delicate, ancient tools the Kalan elite had relentlessly mocked for years. Intricate glass prisms, carefully calibrated crystal spheres, and polished brass acoustic lenses were laid out across the metallic alien dashboard. Moving with the blinding speed of a master craftsman, Alan began to manually splice her primitive, delicate terrestrial instruments directly into the highly advanced, high-voltage neural interfaces of the Kalan broadcasting array. It was at this precise moment that the hollow chorus realized the true nature of the threat. The apex predator of the cosmos sensed the sudden, agonizing shift in the planetary resonance grid. The storm shrieked, a sound that bypassed the ears and tore directly into the soul. The colossal entity abandoned its global consumption and violently collapsed inward, focusing the absolute entirety of its cosmic, telepathic weight directly onto the central control room of the spire. The physical and mental pressure was instantaneous and absolute. The thick, armored glass of the chamber instantly spiderwebbed with millions of fractures. The 3 Kalan soldiers, veteran warriors who had conquered entire star systems, were completely crushed under the unseen weight. Their armor buckled and caved inward, and they collapsed to the floor, instantly reduced to statues of solid, jagged crystal. Valus felt her own massive strength completely evaporate. The psychic gravity forced her violently to her knees. Blood poured freely from her golden eyes and her ears. Her muscles locked in complete, agonizing paralysis. She could not move a single finger. She could not even draw a breath. She was entirely pinned to the floor by the sheer, crushing mass of a dying universe. Yet, standing in the exact epicenter of this localized apocalypse, directly in the focal point of a telepathic pressure that could grind mountains into dust, Alan remained completely unaffected. Her simple gray garments did not even flutter. She finished securing the final brass connector to the main power terminal. The human slowly turned her head to look down at her paralyzed, bleeding Kalan wife. The profound melancholy that had always clouded Alan's eyes was completely gone. In its place was a terrifying, brilliant clarity. She knelt down gracefully amidst the crushing pressure and gently wiped a streak of dark alien blood from Valus's cheek. Alan offered her that familiar, deeply warm smile, but her voice carried the impossible, resonant weight of billions of ancestors who had conquered the stars, not with fire, but with absolute discipline. "Do not be afraid, my love," Alan whispered softly, her words completely immune to the howling psychic hurricane tearing the room apart. "For hundreds of years, we have worn this silence to keep you all safe from the storm within us. But to stop this monster, I am afraid it is finally time to take off humanity's muzzle." Alan stood up slowly. The crushing pressure in the room was immense, but she reached to the back of her neck, pressing 2 fingers against a vital nerve cluster. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. With a sharp, agonizing twist, she physically disengaged the genetic lock implanted by her ancestors. The release was instantaneous. The absolute void of her mind vanished. In its place erupted the raw, unbridled power of human consciousness. It was not a chaotic scream or a violent psychic blast. It was a mathematical absolute, a pure, flawless frequency of order, radiating outward with unimaginable density. The collision between the human frequency and the hollow chorus was catastrophic, yet completely silent. The warring energies bypassed the acoustic spectrum entirely, converting directly into blinding, incandescent light. A brilliant white shockwave expanded from the central spire, sweeping across the sky. Where the light touched the raging green and violet storm, the parasitic resonance simply ceased to exist. The mathematical perfection of Alan's broadcast acted as a cosmic cancellation wave. It systematically dismantled the chaotic structure of the apex predator, stripping away its power until the towering entity shattered. It broke apart into billions of harmless, glowing dust particles that drifted softly down upon the ruined planet like a gentle snowfall. But the physical toll of channeling a planetary scale inverse frequency was immense. The moment the storm vanished, the blinding light faded. The heavy silence of a saved world returned. Alan gasped, the overwhelming power receding as quickly as it had arrived. Her fragile human body, unable to sustain the sheer cosmic voltage of her own mind, gave out entirely. She collapsed onto the cold metal floor, her breathing dangerously shallow, slipping into deep unconsciousness. The Kalan Empire had been miraculously saved from the brink of absolute extinction. But as the surviving warlords emerged from their bunkers to watch the glowing dust fall, they were left in a state of profound, terrified awe. They had finally witnessed the true, devastating might of the human race. 30 days passed since the sky had torn open. The capital city was deep into its reconstruction phase, but Kalan's society was forever altered. The towering, muscular warriors, who once boasted of their psychic dominance, now walked with a quiet, humbled reverence. Whenever the word human was spoken, massive generals would instinctively bow their heads in deep respect. They finally understood a terrifying cosmic truth. The perceived weakness and silence of humanity was not a biological flaw. It was the greatest act of mercy in the galaxy. It was a conscious, agonizing restraint maintained by a species powerful enough to unravel the universe, yet disciplined enough to choose peace. Grand Commander Valus walked quietly down the sterile corridor of the High Command Medical Facility. She pushed open the door to a private recovery room. Sunlight streamed through the large window, illuminating the small figure sitting by the bed. Alan was still recovering, her skin pale and her movements slow. Yet the terrifying godlike weapon that had commanded the storm was gone. In her place was the soft, gentle woman Valus had married. Alan was carefully wiping a cracked glass acoustic sphere with a soft cloth. Valus approached the bed. The proud Kalan warrior did not stand tall. She slowly sank down, dropping to one knee beside her human spouse. Valus no longer looked at Alan as a fragile creature requiring her protection. She looked up at a savior, a being possessing an iron discipline more terrifying and beautiful than any military force in existence. Alan stopped polishing the glass. She looked down at Valus, offering that familiar, warm smile. Her eyes were bright and entirely free of the ancient melancholy. She held out the slightly damaged acoustic sphere toward the kneeling commander. "My hands are still a bit too shaky," Alan said softly, her voice tender and filled with quiet affection. "Could you help me tune this note? I think it is just a little bit flat." Valus reached out, gently wrapping her large, armored hands over Alan's small fingers. In that simple, quiet request lay the ultimate truth of the human soul. They were a people who held the power of total annihilation in their minds. Yet, they would always actively choose to sit in the quiet light and create melodies of healing. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Sci-fi stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.